Oh, good morning, Protégé. Of course, good afternoon to my wonderful and favorite afternoon class. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is going to be my direct instruction for Wednesday, and it is January 26th, 2022. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill at this point. So at this time, you guys should have your ISNs open to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. And again, at this point in the top right-hand corner, you should date your notes again for today. And again, it is January 26, 2022. Again, you need a blue or black pen for your copious note-taking, multiple colored highlighters, and of course, don't forget your correctable tape. But again, as I state at the beginning of every Zoomcast, I'm going to respectfully ask you to not use your correctable tape or your highlighters while you're viewing the Zoomcast. It is really imperative that you provide your absolute optimal effort to observing, listening, taking those really good copious notes, not just the main bullet notes, but remember, adding those additional oral notes as well. I need everybody to get to that next level of really strong note-taking. And again, wait to the very end of the Zoomcast, and that's when you can begin to clean up your ISN and, of course, begin to highlight all of your copious notes today. All right, it's a good one. So once again, top line, every page, again, every day is a new date. It's a new page. So again, don't go back to your previous notes. And every page should have a topic heading or an assignment heading. And so in this case, it's a topic heading, and you're going to write down for me the factors of World War II. So we spent a lot of time on that PowerPoint on Rise of a Madman. Again, if you want to understand the origins of World War II, you better understand the rise of Adolf Schicklgruber, Adolf Hitler. We also studied Benito Mussolini, and then last Zoomcast, direct instructional Zoomcast, we finished up, of course, Joseph Stalin, Losif Vissarionovich Jugasvili, also known as Joseph Stalin, the Man of Steel. All right, so we've covered our three evil dictators of World War II. Now we're going to be getting into some other factors as well. And one of the big factors of World War II is what we call the the Sino-Japanese Wars between 1931 through 1945. So you're looking at about 14 years, a series of wars. Now, whenever you see Sino-Japanese, you got to figure out, okay, so who are the combatants? So this part's easy. You have right here, of course, Japan. And then Sino, and what I would like, this is a great example of the importance of good oral note-taking, to draw a line off to the side and write China, because that's what we're talking about. It's the wars that were fought between the Chinese and the Japanese between 1931 through 1945, which marks the end of World War II. All right, so let's get into it. So it all goes back to 1931. And in 1931, the Japanese are going to launch a full-scale invasion of an area that's known as Manchuria. Now, before I get into the importance, and again, I want to also reiterate the importance of the beauty of these Zoomcasts is there will be times I will be going a little bit faster, and that's okay. I can do that because I know that you can pause the Zoomcast at any time you want. If you feel you need to go back and replay something again, please do it. This is not a race to finish first. It's a race to really do well and to provide your optimal effort. All right, little geography lesson. So where's Manchuria? So if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, what I'm circling with my cursor, this is Manchuria. This is located, and you should draw a line off to the side, northeastern China. So to the north, you've got, well, they write Russia, but at this point, there is no Russia. Russia was one of the republics of course, the Soviet Union. To the west, you have Mongolia. This, of course, is all China. And then way down over here is, of course, North and then South Korea. Now, at this point in 1931, we did not have two Koreas like we have today in 2022. It was still one country. All right. So what's the importance behind it? So number one, so one of the reasons why the Japanese will invade Manchuria is because this area of China is laden with natural resources and raw materials, things like coal, things like iron ore, things that could be used to make weapons. And remember, when you compare China with the size of Japan, Japan doesn't have the landmass that China does, so therefore it's limited in raw materials. Now, another part of the story is indirectly, not directly, but indirectly, the United States basically motivated the Japanese to begin to really change their perspective in the world around them. Japan had been a really isolated, peaceful nation. But if you go back to the late 1840s, early 1850s, I believe it was 1853, when Matthew Perry and the Great Black Fleet had landed in Japan itself, this really shocked the Japanese leaders because for centuries they had been isolated from the rest of the world. And they saw this fleet with, again, these black ships. They were spewing out the smoke with the coal and such. And it was at this point that the Japanese decided they were going to begin to transition away from being this isolated society based on agriculture and farming to a society that was based on industry. And so as a result, when you are industrializing, there is always a need for natural resources. So again, I'm not suggesting that the United States allowed Japan, and we know Japan embraced militarism, but again, we indirectly basically set the wheels into motion for the Japanese getting to this point in terms of the timeline of history. Now, number two, so when the Japanese took over Manchuria right here, they decided to give it a more Japanese sounding name, and they called it Manchukuo. Now, at this point, the Chinese, again, turned to the League of Nations. And isn't this the whole point and the purpose of the League of Nations? To say, hey, we have this aggressive nation. They've gone in, they've invaded and taken over a big part of our country. What are you going to do about this? And this was one of the first big tests of the League of Nations. And sadly, the League of Nations basically did nothing. And then a little bit shortly afterwards, the Japanese, or I should say Japan, will eventually leave the League of Nations completely. So this is, again, is foreshadowing what's to come, basically when war officially begins in 1939. But some could argue that World War II actually started before the Nazis invaded my ancestral homeland of Poland. And certainly these are, again, basically the stepping stones, if you will, to the worst war ever waged in recorded history. All right. Now, before we go any further, I want you to write this down. And I think it's important to understand the size and the scope and the sequence of World War II. So remember when we studied World War I, we learned we focused on the Western Front. We briefly studied the Eastern Front. There was also fighting in the Middle East and present-day Turkey, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, and even the Italian front on the border between Italy and Austria. World War II is going to cover a much bigger area, even beyond World War I. So there were three major theaters of World War II that you're going to need to be familiar with in A, understanding the war, and B, in preparation for your next assessment. So number one, you have what we call the European theater war. It's kind of a play on words. You know, a theater is where you go to see a performance. But the difference is when you go to watch a play or a musical at a theater, again, they're just performing. This is not a performance. This is real life. This is just a play on words. So again, if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, so this is a map of the European theater of the war. Let me get this out of the way. There we go. So what's interesting, and I would draw a line or two off to the side. So once again, you're going to have a Western front. Cuts through part of France into parts of Belgium. We call them the Low Countries. You have, of course, the Eastern Front. This is going to be the fighting between Germany and the Soviet Union. In World War I, it was Germany versus Russia. But the same as World War II over here, you're going to have the Brits, you're going to have the French to a lesser degree, and the Americans fighting against the Nazis here. And you even have, I wouldn't call it an Italian front per se. I would call it the Italian campaign. It was the fighting that was being waged on, of course, or in Italy, 1942, but really into 1943 through 1944. Time permitting, I'll talk about that as well. So that's your European theater of the war. So number two, now this is a little change. This is different as compared to what we studied in World War I. We have what's called the North African theater of the war. So when you talk about the North African theater of the war, and I'm going to again shift my picture over to the side. So these are the countries in North Africa that are going to play a role in the molding and shaping and the eventual outcome of World War II. Countries like, and you might want to add this as a side oral note, pause the Zoomcast, Morocco, Algeria, right here, Tunisia. Tunisia is huge. I would put an asterisk by it because this is going to be part of the launching point when the Allies are going to launch a full-scale invasion, first of Sicily, which is going to be called Operation Husky, which in turn is going to lead to what we call the Italian campaign. Time permitting, I'll talk about that. Libya and Egypt. Here's another country. I would write it down and put an asterisk by it. As a matter of fact, right here, where is that? Right there. See that dot? It's called El Alamein. This is considered to be one of the seminal, most significant battles was waged at El Alamein in Egypt. And again, time permitting, I will talk about that as well. There are so many different topics and so many different players to talk about World War II. You could easily spend 2 to 3 months on World War II. It's that big in its scope and sequence. And then finally, number 3, so then we have the Pacific or Asian theater of the war. So this is, again, another change compared to World War I. There really wasn't a lot of fighting in the Pacific, minimal fighting, to be honest with you, almost, well, can I say no fighting? Pretty much. Now, with regards to World War II, that's a different story. So in World War II, when you talk about the Pacific theater of the war, you should draw a line off to the side. So that's going to be the fighting between the United States and the Empire of Japan. And this is Japan right over here. So when you talk about the Pacific theater, we learned about Pearl Harbor. We're going to talk more about that later on. You learned about Pearl Harbor with the action-reaction diagram. But also, you're going to be learning about places like Midway, places like Guadalcanal, places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These were all major places and sites of significant battles in the Pacific theater of World War II. All right, let's continue on. So now I'm going to fast forward it 6 years. So it's now July and it's 1937. And by July of 1937, the Japanese decide that they're going to really start to ramp up their aggression. Aggression is, again, when you're acting in a military manner and you're going after another country, trying to take it over, acts of aggression. So now Japan says, we're not just satisfied with Manchuria, we're going to take over the entire mainland of China itself. So let me share some key points with you guys. Number 1, so one of the earliest places that the Japanese are going to occupy in China is a major city that's called Nanjing. And if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen or up to my laptop screen, here's Nanjing located right here, right along the Yangtze River, right there, okay? Moving on, number 2. But this is where, when the Japanese occupy Nanjing in the eastern part of the mainland of China, this is where the story is going to take a very dark and ominous turn, because what's going to happen is the Japanese soldiers go on, you have to be blunt, a killing spree. And they're going to specifically not only just be going after and targeting Chinese soldiers, but also Chinese civilians. Some will be machine guns, some will be bayoneted, and some will be buried alive. So what I would like for you to do is I would like everybody to now pause the Zoomcast, and I would like you to draw a line off to the side and take about 2 to 3 minutes. And I would like for you to describe for me this photograph. This photograph was taken after Japanese troops had invaded and tried to seize control over Nanjing, which again is one of the major cities in the mainland of China. I, of course, am going to continue on. So this horrific incident that took place in the summer of 1937 is called the Massacre of Nanjing, or some would call it the Rape of Nanjing. Again, it basically, this is foreshadowing what's going to come about when we start to focus more on the European theater of the war, when the Nazis invaded my ancestral homeland of Poland on September 1st, 1939, and then segueing into the North African theater of the war when I teach you guys, time permitting, about the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt in 1942. Let's continue on. So what was the importance of the massacre or the rape of Nanjing? It again is an absolute foreshadowing of what's to come. And that's exactly, I'm going to reemphasize this again. So what happened in Nanjing, China in the summer of 1937 is going to foreshadow when the war really starts ramping up in 1939, when Nazi Germany invades my ancestral homeland of Poland. It really does foreshadow the brutality of World War II. So once again, I'm going to ask everybody to pause the Zoomcast. I would like for you to draw a line off to the side, and I would like for you to take about 2 minutes. And once again, I would like for you to write for me a reflection describing for me this horrific photograph that was taken again in the Pacific theater of World War II. I'm going to continue on. Now, another reason why the massacre at Nanjing, China in 1937 was significant is because I'm going to introduce you one of the most complex, and I would go so far as to say controversial figures of World War II, and his name was John Rabe. So if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, or to my laptop screen, this is a poster. It was, again, promoting a movie that was made several years ago about this very controversial figure, a gentleman by the name of John Rabe, which you're going to learn about in a short period of time. So here's what we're going to do. I want you to write this down for me. And the question is, what is it that these three individuals share in common? Okay, and I want you to write this down in your ISN. So number one of these individuals is a gentleman by the name of Oskar Schindler. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, this is a photograph of Oskar Schindler. Take a good look at this photograph. You'll probably see him on your next assessment. All right, number two, the next key player, gentleman by the name of Raoul Wallenberg. And again, if you would direct your attention up to my laptop screen, that's a photograph of Raoul Wallenberg. And the third of these individuals was a gentleman by the name of John Rabe. And that's whom we're going to be learning more about shortly. And if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, that is John Rabe. So what is it that these three gentlemen all have in common? And the answer is they are all what we call upstanders. And I want you to draw a line off to the side and add this as a side oral note. An upstander is somebody who proactively takes a stand, takes action. So what is it these three guys did? And the answer is they all saved lives, again, prior to and during World War II. So we'll start with Oskar Schindler right here. Oskar Schindler was a businessman. He was a factory owner, and he owned factories in parts of Germany and also in Poland. And towards the middle to the end of World War II, Oskar Schindler is credited with saving over 1,200 European Jews by employing them and having them work for him in these factories. Otherwise, they would have been deported into some of those most very notorious death camps, like, for example, Auschwitz. He is, again, an upstander. Raoul Wallenberg's an interesting guy. He was born in Sweden, actually went to the same college as of course, Mr. Podolsky, my wonderful colleague next door, the University of Michigan, studied architecture, went back to Sweden, became a diplomat. And at the end, towards the end of the war, he was responsible for saving, we estimate, over several thousand Hungarian Jews who would have otherwise ended up being, like, again, with Oskar Schindler, they would have been sent to, again, these death camps like Auschwitz. Sadly, Raoul Wallenberg was eventually captured by the Soviet Union's Red Army, and then we think he died several years after the war ended in 1947. It's still one of the mysteries exactly what happened to Raoul Wallenberg. But like Oskar Schindler right here, Raoul Wallenberg was an upstander, and again, responsible for saving several thousand Hungarian Jews who otherwise would have perished during the Holocaust. And then, of course, we have this guy right here. And this is the guy we're going to learn a little bit more about. And his name is John Rabe. John Rabe is a really complex individual. John Rabe was a German businessman. He worked for a corporation called Siemens. All the electrical work many, many years ago, when D102 was bringing in the internet into all the classrooms, this is even before you guys were born, the electrical work, if you look at the phones in the classrooms, if you look in the back of the phones, you'll see Siemens. This is the same company that John Rabe worked for. John Rabe was not only a businessman who worked for Siemens Corporation out of Germany, he was also a card-carrying Nazi. Absolutely considered himself a loyal member of the Nazi Party. But if you study Chinese history of the 20th century, John Rabe is considered to be a very special individual. It's in some circles of China, John Rabe was considered to be a living Buddha, as you're going to find out very, very shortly. So what I'd like everybody to do is put your pens down for a moment, and I'm going to share with you back-to-back video clips. The first video clip is a trailer from the movie that was made about John Rabe. And just to kind of give you an idea of who John Rabe was and what exactly he was responsible for doing. So here we go. We'll start with the trailer first. So this is a little over 2 minutes long.
Geben Sie durch, dass die Japaner in die Stadt eingedrungen sind. Nanjing ist gefallen. Irgendjemand muss sich kümmern.
Irgendjemand vielleicht, aber nicht du.
Mach das Tor auf! Soll ich zusehen, wie die zu Tode gebombt werden? Jetzt! Los! Wir brauchen tonnenweise Reis, Geld, Wasser, Medikamente. Ich kann was bewirken, ich kann was machen. You wanna shoot me? Go ahead. Alle runter die Fahne!
So have you figured out, again, what made John Rabe so controversial and so complex? Remember I stated, he worked for the Siemens Corporation. He was, again, an engineer, a businessman, spoke fluent Chinese, was living in China at the time when the Japanese had launched the full-scale invasion of the mainland of China. And then he did something else that makes him what we would call an upstander, something that he shares in common with Raoul Wallenberg and, of course, Oskar Schindler. All right, so I need you to skip a full page, and I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Once again, I would like everybody to date your notes again for today. It's January 26, 2022. So now you're going to learn a little bit more about who John Rabe really was. And again, it's a little bit disappointing. I wish TCI had mentioned him. I always talk about John Rabe. I think it's a fascinating story. He's a complex individual, and that's why human beings are interesting, because we are complex. Again, there's a lot of gray areas to all of us. So I'm going to give you some guide questions. I'm going to go through these guide questions quickly to help you take some really good notes. And again, you guys do such a great job. I love the fact the way you pause the Zoomcast. Give yourself a chance to catch up in terms of your copious note-taking. Do the same thing again. Here we go. Number one, what do the Chinese refer to John Rabe as? I already gave a clue a little bit earlier. And remember, just to reiterate, John Rabe was in China at the time of the Japanese invasion of the mainland of China itself, 1937. He was a card-carrying, and he considered himself to be a loyal member of the Nazi Party. But John Rabe did something pretty miraculous, pretty special. Skip a line or two. So number two. So I kind of gave you a bit of an overview, but now I'd like you to explain a little bit more. The movie does a nice job. This video clip does a nice job. Who exactly was John Rabe? I want you to be able to describe him in more detail. Number three, What was the Japanese plan for the invasion of China in 1937? So again, I gave you just a quick little preview in my direct instruction. We went back to Manchuria in 1931. The League of Nations basically does nothing. And then again, 1937, now the Japanese launch a full-scale invasion of the mainland of China, targeting specifically, if you noticed earlier in that promo, they mentioned Nanking. That was the original name of China. It's also known as Nanjing. What was one of the causes of the behavior of the Japanese army? In other words, why is it that for over 6 weeks, the Japanese army began to massacre, again, hundreds and thousands of Chinese civilians? What was John Rabe's plan to save the Chinese, the civilians? All right, so ladies and gentlemen, so again, this video clip is about a little over 7 minutes long. And again, I think it's a very powerful one describing a very complex and fascinating individual when you're studying the history of World War II. His name is John Rabe.
Nanjing, a great Chinese city of 6 million souls. Close to its center, there's a monument to a man many Chinese still call the good person of Nanjing, John Rabe, a German and a Nazi. He's worshipped here as a hero, a living Buddha. In the West, he's unknown. No one remembers that he saved the lives of more than 200,000 people. At the Massacre of Nanjing. This, one of the great war crimes of the 20th century, took place more than 70 years ago. When the Japanese took this city, looting, raping, and murdering, Rabe was there to witness the atrocity. He was an ordinary middle manager at an engineering company. Today, only his diaries bear witness to what he achieved. His grandson looks after them. The testimony of a man who worshipped Hitler and did good deeds, who stubbornly pursued a simple idea and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. The battle for Shanghai, the beginning of the Japanese invasion of China. The Japanese Empire has used a small firefight as a pretext to launch a massive incursion. The Japanese plan calls for the capture of Shanghai in 3 days, but Tokyo has miscalculated. The Chinese army puts up fierce resistance. Hundreds of thousands die. Shanghai doesn't fall until the 9th of November, 3 months later. The strategy of the quick victory has failed. 70,000 Japanese soldiers have been killed.
As a result of that, there was a very heightened sense for revenge among the Japanese troops, down to the ordinary soldier who has lost his comrade. And this, in some ways, was one of the causes for the behavior of the Japanese troops after the Battle of Shanghai.
New orders are issued. March on Nanjing, then Nanking, China's capital, 270 kilometers to the west. But Japanese troops are exhausted and their supply lines are almost non-existent. They advance, leaving a bloody trail of pillage and murder. Within days, the first bombs are falling on Nanking in what soon becomes a daily assault. John Rabe is on vacation far away from Nanking. He hurries back to the office and his work for Siemens, the German industrial giant. He knows the city only has weeks before the Japanese arrive. He can follow their progress via Radio Shanghai still broadcasting after the takeover. Since the attack on Shanghai, John Rabe has kept a diary. The early entries make depressing reading.
All the wealthy Chinese have long ago begun to flee up the Yangtze. Many Americans and Germans have gone with them.
Hundreds of Western diplomats and businessmen have sent their families ahead of them to safety. They're staying only long enough to wind up their affairs. John Rabe is lucky. His wife Dora is staying on at their vacation resort. His children and grandchildren have already left China. Rabe must make a decision.
But there is one moral point I cannot get past. Our Chinese servants and employees all look up to their master. These poor serving classes simply do not know what to do. Have I the right to run away under these circumstances? I think not. Anyone who has ever held the hand of a Chinese child for hours on end, squatting in a dugout during an air raid, will know what I mean.
Mein Großvater war hanseatischer Kaufmann. Er war pflichtbewusst und korrekt im Umgang mit seinem Arbeitgeber und seinen Kunden. In seinem privaten Umfeld war er dominant, aber sonst war er eigentlich ein schlichter und bescheidener Mensch.
A few others will also stay in the city. Georg Rosen, a diplomat at the German embassy, and 2 American missionaries, Minnie Vautrin and John McGee. They all know each other from Nanking's exclusive international club. But all they really have in common at this moment is their decision to remain in the doomed city. They've turned their backs on the river Yangtze, the only sure means of escape. Nanking has always been a fortress city, protected by 35 kilometers of city wall, 15 meters high. But in the 20th century, a wall like this won't hold up the invaders. It will confine the inhabitants like rats in a trap. Behind the city is the Yangtze. There is no bridge. But Rabe and his colleagues come up with a daring idea. With the remaining foreign community, they could try to create a protection zone inside the city for women, children, and the elderly. It could cover several square kilometers. They know from Shanghai that something like this is feasible. Only now is it possible to tell the story of how Rabe and his colleagues put their plan to action. Historian Huang Huiying has trawled the Nanjing city archives to reconstruct the events.
So to go back and dovetail off of what we watched with that video, a couple of observations. So number one, so again, John Rabe, again, created this really ingenious plan to save hundreds and thousands of Chinese civilians, of course, in Nanjing, which in those days was called Nanking, right on the shores or the banks of the Yangtze River, because they were trapped. But to create this protection zone, if you will, using his diplomatic ties to Nazi Germany. So again, as a result of John Rabe's actions, over 200, and we estimate between 200 and 250,000 Chinese civilians, men, women, and children were saved that otherwise would have been massacred as a result of the Japanese invasion of the mainland of China, focusing at this point on Nanjing. So it really raises a very poignant question. And I'd like you to do me a favor and pause the Zoomcast now. And I want you to take about 3 minutes and I want you to draw a line off to the side. I want you to write a brief 1-paragraph reflection. And here's what I want you to reflect on. So here's John Rabe, a businessman, works for Siemens, a card-carrying Nazi, as they mentioned in the video clip, but also somebody who was very loyal and very determined to save as many Chinese civilians as he possibly could. On one hand, again, a member of a party that was responsible for millions of deaths as a result of World War II. On the other hand, saved several 100,000 Chinese civilians from certain death. Remember, in Nanjing, he's considered the good man of Nanjing and a living Buddha. So can a person be a Nazi and at the same time be a good person? Is it possible to be both a Nazi and do good at the same time? You tell me. There's no right or wrong answer. Just curious what you think and what you write. So I want you to pause the Zoomcast for about 3 minutes. Write me a really well-written paragraph. I, of course, am going to continue on. All right. So we're going to shift gears, and I'm going to introduce this factor to you guys. I don't know if I'll finish it all. We'll play it by ear. So now we're going to get into the fifth factor of World War II. So we learned about the rise of Hitler. We learned about the rise of Mussolini. We learned about the rise of Joseph Stalin, our three evil dictators. You just learned about the Sino-Japanese War, basically foreshadowing the coming of World War II. And again, now we're going to go back to the European theater of the war, and we're going to focus on what's called the Munich Conference of 1938. So these are all the factors that were eventually building towards, again, the worst recorded war in the history of this world. All right, so let's talk about the key players involved first of all. So number one, so the Munich Conference was a conference that was held in Munich, Germany in 1938. Who are the major players involved? So we're going to go talk about each of them. So number one of the key players was a leader in France. His name was Edouard Daladier. That's how you pronounce his name. So Edouard Daladier. He represents, of course, the French. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, that, of course, is Edouard Daladier. Take a good look at that photograph. There's a good chance you're going to be seeing him on your next assessment. Number two, of course, Il Duce, the fascist leader of Italy. He was also invited to the Munich Conference of 1938. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, that, of course, is Il Duce Benito Mussolini. Number three, the Prime Minister of Great Britain at this time was a gentleman by the name of Neville Chamberlain. And again, we want to associate a name with a face and a face with a name. If you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, that's Neville Chamberlain. And in his hand right here, see what I'm circling with the cursor? He's holding what's called the Munich Pact, which was signed as a result of the Munich Conference. And then finally, number four, the host of the Munich Conference, and that, of course, is Schicklgruber, Adolf Hitler. So those are your four major players that were involved. Daladier representing France, Mussolini representing Italy, Neville Chamberlain representing Great Britain, and again, of course, Adolf Hitler representing, of course, Germany. He, of course, was hosting this gathering. Now, this raises a really interesting question. And the question is, who wasn't there? And sometimes when you study, again, these events in history, what's equally fascinating is not just who was there, but also who wasn't there or who was not invited to the party, if you will. And I'm speaking, again, euphemistically. So number one, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not present at the Munich Conference. Call it a hunch. I have a very strong suspicion that the Brits and the French desperately wanted to see Roosevelt involved, just like the way the Brits and the French wanted the Americans involved when World War I was raging on. They're getting very nervous about some of the things that Hitler had been doing in Nazi Germany for the past several years. So why is it that Franklin Roosevelt was not there? And I would draw a line off to the side. And the answer is because by 1937, again, Congress had passed what's called the Neutrality Acts, and the United States was embracing this policy of neutrality. We're not going to be getting involved anytime soon in anything that's going on in Europe. So I would suspect that Roosevelt would have liked to have been there, but the mood of this country in 1937 was, we fought in World War I. We do not want to get involved again in another major potential war in Europe for World War II, and that's coming down the pike. So yeah, he wanted to be there. The Brits and the French definitely wanted him there, but he is not going to attend because America, once again, is embracing that policy of neutrality. All right, number two. Now, in addition, the other guy that was not present at the Munich Conference was, of course, the evil dictator of the Soviet Union, and that, of course, was Losif Vissarionovich Zhugashvili, also known as Joseph Stalin. Now, Stalin wanted to be there desperately, but he was not invited at all. Now, there's a couple of reasons why Stalin wasn't invited. Number one, because Hitler, as he was rising to power, and I would draw a line off this side, Hitler hated the communists. That was his first group that he targeted. So being a fascist like Mussolini, they do not want to share the same table with a communist like Stalin. And then from the Brits and the French point of view, they don't trust Stalin and they don't trust the Soviet Union. They're still angry about when Russia had signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk back in March of 1918, when they secretly were able to negotiate with the Germans and got out of fighting in World War I. So there was still some lingering mistrust between the Allies and what is now the Soviet Union. Now, in the case of Stalin, and I would draw another line off to the side, Stalin was very angry. He felt that, Soviet Union should have been present. He wanted the Soviet Union to be considered at the same level as the Brits and the French and the Germans. And so he's not going to forget the fact that he was snubbed and not invited to this gathering in Munich, Germany. What's interesting is he doesn't blame the Nazis or the fascists of Italy, but rather he's going to hold it against the Brits and the French. And then finally, the other country that was not a member or not participating in, of course, the Munich conference was Czechoslovakia. And if there's any country that should be present at the Munich conference, and that country should have been Czechoslovakia, because really the Munich conference this is the country that stands the most to lose as a result of it. So why was Czechoslovakia, which basically in essence, this was the gist of why they were all gathering in Munich, Germany in 1938. And the biggest reason why Czechoslovakia was not invited is because the Allies simply did not want to irritate Hitler at this point. And you have to understand and I'm not excusing the Brits and the French, but remember, there's a lot of people that are getting nervous about a potential another war breaking out. And right now, the Brits and the French are not interested in experiencing round two fighting against the Germans. So what do we mean by they did not want to irritate, again, Hitler? And the answer is, and you should draw a line off to the side. This is a great example of oral notes. All right. So you see this area right here that I'm circling with my cursor, okay? So this area in 1938 was considered part of Czechoslovakia. It was created way back in 1919. So if you look at the key unlocks the mystery to the map. But prior to 1919 and the Treaty of Versailles, this area that I'm circling with the cursor right here, that was all part of Germany. We call this the Sudetenland. And so as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, this area of Germany was given to Czechoslovakia. So that means you now have ethnic Germans that are living under Czechoslovakian rule. And this is, again, a really sore subject with Hitler. And so that was one of the reasons why, again, the Allies did not want to invite Czechoslovakia, because they knew that this was going to be a big topic of conversation with regards to the major players that were involved in the negotiations at Munich, Germany in 1938. All right, so what exactly were the key issues at the Munich conference of 1938? So at this point, I'm just going to go into just a general overview, just give a couple quick points, and then we're going to wrap up my Zoomcast. So number one, one of the big topics of conversation actually transpired 2 years earlier, because in 1936, Hitler had basically Hitler and Germany had decided to militarily occupy an area of land in the western part of Germany. We, of course, know it as the Rhineland. And if you direct your attention up to my screen, this is the Rhineland right here. So you see where the color code is right here? So the Rhineland is located right over here. This is the western part of Germany. Now, I would draw a line off to the side. The reality of the matter is, even though this is Germany, as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, and this is what you want to add as an oral note, the Treaty of Versailles strongly stated that you could not go and occupy this area of land militarily. So what Hitler has done is he has blatantly broken the Treaty of Versailles. And so this was a topic of conversation to not only discuss what Hitler had done, but also what are the consequences as a result of breaking the Treaty of Versailles by going and again occupying this area of land. And then number two, the other big topic of conversation, besides Germany's military occupation of the Rhineland, was in 1938, Hitler demands this area known as the Sudetenland. I had mentioned that just a few moments ago. And again, this is where geography plays such a huge critical role, especially when you're talking about World War I and World War II. So here's my map again of World War II, Central Europe. Look at the color key. So this is the Sudetenland right here. This was an area of land that was part of Germany, but in 1919, this area of Germany was given to Czechoslovakia in the creation of this new country. And so now in 1938, you got Hitler basically saying, we want it back. The question is, how are the Allies going to address Adolf Hitler's demands? Well, you tell me. So at this point, I'm going to stop the Zoomcast. And what I would like everybody to do is take out your correctable tape and your highlighters. And I want you to go through all your notes today. And I want you to clean up anything that you crossed out or traced over. In addition, multiple colored highlighters, tip of the tip. A good example, use one highlighter for your guide questions and a different highlighter for the notes you took on the video clip on John Rabe. And go and focus on those words you can visualize in your mind, the persons, places, and things. Now, in addition, besides that, also remember, you're not done yet. You still need to go back and review your ISN, the 10 to 15 minutes. Again, it's practice. It's reinforcing that information. You practice for cricket, you practice for soccer, you practice swimming. Why aren't you practicing school every day? And if you have an opportunity, hand your ISN to your mom or dad or somebody in the house. Create a Zoom session or a FaceTime session with another classmate, and you channel the inner Mr. Bonk, and you teach the information we covered today. Why did the Japanese go into Manchuria? Why did they invade the mainland of China in 1937? Again, what was the big city in Eastern China that the Japanese are going to target? What happened in that fateful time, that period of about 6 weeks in 1937 in the mainland of China involving the Empire of Japan? Who was John Rabe? Who was Oskar Schindler? Who was Raoul Wallenberg? And why is it that all three of these very complex individuals were all considered to be upstanders? And what made John Rabe such a very complex individual? What can somebody be a Nazi and at the same time do something really good, like in the case of John Rabe, saving over 250,000 Chinese civilians from certain death at the hands of the Japanese army? And then, of course, we moved on to the Munich conference. Who were the four major countries there? Who were their representatives, like Edward Daladier representing, of course, France, and of course, Neville Chamberlain representing Great Britain? What were the two big topics of conversation? Who were the two leaders that were not present that probably should have been present? And what exactly was it that Hitler had done? One of the big topics of conversation that was blatantly breaking the Treaty of Versailles, and what exactly were the Allies going to do about this act of aggression? So again, I hope everybody enjoyed my Zoomcast today as much as I enjoyed making it. So as I always like to say, as I wrap up my Zoomcast, and for the next one, what we'll do is we're going to get more into the Munich conference on the road to the start of World War II. And as I always like to say, as I wrap up the Zoomcast, you know, the story may have ended today, but you know the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone, is history. Peace out, everybody. Thank you so much. And as always, please be well.